You've studied English for years. You know thousands of words. You've memorized grammar rules. You can read books, watch movies, and understand most of what you hear. But when it's time to speak, your mouth freezes. The words get stuck. Your tongue feels heavy. Your sentences come out slow, broken, or robotic. Does that sound familiar? If it does, you're not alone. In fact, this is the reality for millions of English learners around the world. The truth is, fluency is not just knowledge in your brain, it's training in your mouth. Why English speaking feels so hard? Here's the problem most learners face. They think learning English is only about studying. Studying grammar, studying vocabulary, studying listening skills. And yes, those things matter. But when it comes to speaking, there's an extra layer, one that is often ignored. Speaking is a physical skill. Just like playing the guitar, dancing, or swimming. You cannot just think about it. You have to train your body, and in English, the body part you train is your mouth, your lips, your tongue, your jaw, your vocal cords. Think about athletes. A runner doesn't just read books about running, they run. A boxer doesn't just watch videos. They train their arms, their legs, their reactions. Speaking English is the same. You have to train your mouth muscles to move in a way that feels natural in English. The physical side of language. Let me ask you a question. When you speak your native language, do you think about every sound you make? Of course not. Your mouth just knows what to do. It's automatic. Why? Because since you were a baby, you've been training those muscles every single day. But English is different. English has sounds, rhythms, and patterns that may not exist in your language. Maybe your language doesn't use the th sound. Maybe it doesn't use rising and falling intonation. Maybe your language has syllables that are flat and equal, while English has stressed beats like music. That means your mouth isn't used to moving in the English way. And if you don't train it, your brain may know English, but your mouth won't be able to produce it smoothly. That's why people say, I understand English, but I can't speak it. The real issue is not your brain. It's your mouth. Fluency is a muscle memory skill. Here's the key idea. Fluency is built through muscle memory. Muscle memory means your body remembers how to move without thinking. For example, when you ride a bicycle, you don't consciously plan every pedal or every balance movement. Your body just knows. When you type on a keyboard, you don't spell out every letter in your mind. You just type. Speaking English must feel the same. At first, you think hard. How do I say this? Where should my tongue go? What's the grammar rule? But with daily physical training, your mouth begins to move automatically. That's when fluency is born, when the brain and the mouth work together without delay. Why most learners stay stuck? Now let's be honest. Why do so many learners stay stuck at the I can understand but not speak level? It's because they spend 95% of their time in passive learning, reading, listening, studying grammar. These are mental activities, but they spend almost no time in active physical training of speech. It's like trying to learn basketball by only reading books about basketball. You may know the rules, but you won't know how to play until you get on the court. The same is true for English. Until you move your mouth daily, until you practice speaking out loud, until you feel the physical rhythm of English, your fluency will stay locked inside your head. The missing link, mouth training. So here's the breakthrough. If you want to speak fluent English, you must train your mouth like an athlete trains muscles. That means loosening your jaw so it doesn't feel stiff, stretching your tongue so it can make new sounds, rolling your lips so they produce English rhythm, practicing clusters of words until they flow naturally. This is not theory, it's action. And the best part? You don't need hours of practice. Just 5 minutes a day of focused physical training can transform your speaking ability in 30 days. A new way to see English. Let me give you a new perspective. Stop thinking of English as just a language to learn. Start thinking of it as a skill to train. When you see English this way, everything changes. You don't worry about being perfect. You don't wait until you know enough. You don't fear mistakes. Instead, you get into the habit of training daily, little by little, just like going to the gym. And just like exercise, the results build up. Day by day, your muscles remember. Your voice grows stronger. Your rhythm becomes smoother. And suddenly, you find yourself speaking without hesitation. The promise of this training. In this program, you will learn a structured method. 1 minute of mouth warm-ups to loosen your muscles. 1 minute of mirror practice to build confidence. 2 minutes of shadow speaking to train rhythm. 1 minute of fluency loops to play with speed and flow. That's it, 5 minutes a day. But those 5 minutes, done consistently, will change everything. You'll go from slow and robotic speech to natural, confident English. You'll go from silence and fear to expression and freedom. Because fluency is not talent. It's not about being born good at languages. Fluency is simply consistent training. Why this matters to you. Think about your life. Why do you want English fluency? Maybe it's for your career to get that better job or promotion. Maybe it's for study, to pass exams or study abroad. Maybe it's for travel, to connect with people around the world. Or maybe it's simply for self-confidence to feel proud when you speak. Whatever your reason, the ability to speak fluently will open doors. But those doors will only open if you take action, if you stop waiting and start training today. Motivational call. So here's my message to you. Don't let fear hold you back. Don't let perfection stop you. Don't wait for someday. Your English voice is waiting. It's inside you. But you have to bring it out with daily practice. You have to train your mouth. You have to push through the discomfort and claim your voice. Because fluency is not something you magically get in the future. Fluency is something you build today. One mouth movement, one cluster, one repetition at a time. Transition to the next part. In the next section, we'll dive into the heart of English as a physical language. You'll discover why English rhythm and sound are so different from your native language, and how to train your mouth to adapt to this new rhythm. Once you understand that, every practice session will make more sense, so stay with me. The journey has just begun. Building daily habits and the 5-minute routine. Fluency is not built in one day, 1 week, or one class. It is built through consistent daily habits. And the truth is that even 5 focused minutes can transform your English if you commit to them every single day. Because fluency is not about how much you study in one sitting. It's about how often you repeat the right actions until they become automatic. Imagine your mouth as a muscle. If you lift a heavy weight once a month, nothing changes. But if you lift a smaller weight every day, your muscles grow stronger and your body adapts. Speaking English works the same way, and your 5-minute routine is that daily workout that rewires your mouth and brain together. The routine is simple but powerful. 1 minute of warm-ups to loosen your lips, tongue, and jaw. 1 minute of mirror practice to face yourself and build presence. 2 minutes of shadow speaking where you mimic native clips and ride the rhythm of English like music. And 1 final minute of fluency loops where you play with speed, slow, normal, fast, until your mouth feels comfortable moving without hesitation. That's it. Just 5 minutes. But those minutes done consistently are worth more than hours of silent grammar study because they build muscle memory, and muscle memory is the secret to fluency. The key is consistency. Every day, no excuses, no waiting for the perfect time. because missing one day may not feel like much, but missing several breaks the chain, and fluency grows only when the chain is unbroken. Think of brushing your teeth. It takes only a few minutes, but you do it daily because the habit protects your health. Speaking fluency must be treated the same way as a daily hygiene of your voice. When you practice daily, something subtle happens. You stop overthinking, you stop doubting, and you start trusting your mouth to do what it has been trained to do. At first, it feels mechanical, even strange, but as the days pass, you'll notice your sentences flowing more easily, your tongue moving without conscious effort, your confidence rising as your brain no longer wastes energy translating or analyzing. And here's the truth. You don't need long sessions. You don't need a classroom. You don't need perfection. You just need discipline, 5 minutes, focused, repeated without fail. And over time, those minutes will add up to hours, those hours to days, and those days to a new identity. A person who speaks English naturally, freely, and confidently. So if you want fluency, don't wait for tomorrow. Don't plan for someday. Start today, right now, with 5 minutes of focused training, and watch how your mouth, your brain, and your confidence transform one day at a time. Mirror technique and confidence training. The mirror is one of the simplest yet most powerful tools for building fluency. Because when you stand in front of it, you are not just practicing English. You are confronting your own fear, your own hesitation, and your own identity as an English speaker. And that experience transforms the way you use your voice. Many learners avoid mirrors because they feel self-conscious. They don't like the way they sound, or they fear looking foolish. But the truth is that the mirror is your first real audience. And if you can face yourself with confidence, you can face anyone. The exercise is simple. Stand tall, look into your own eyes, and speak one sentence out loud, slowly at first, watching how your lips move, how your tongue shapes sounds, how your jaw opens and closes, and then repeat that same sentence a little faster, and then faster still, until the rhythm feels natural. This is not just pronunciation practice. This is presence training. By watching yourself, you teach your brain that your voice is real, that your mouth movements are strong, and that you do not need to hide from your own sound. And every repetition in front of the mirror chips away at fear, builds familiarity, and replaces self-doubt with self-assurance. Think about performers, actors, and speakers. They rehearse in front of mirrors not only to check how they look, but to build the confidence to deliver their message with authority. And you must treat your English training the same way, because fluency is not just about the mouth. It is also about the mind, and the mirror connects both. At first, you may cringe at your mistakes or feel awkward seeing yourself speak in another language. But keep going, because that discomfort is actually the signal that you are stepping out of silence and into growth. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. Until one day you no longer see a learner in the reflection, you see a fluent communicator. The mirror builds self-awareness. It forces you to notice details like tension in your jaw or stiffness in your lips, and it gives you immediate feedback without judgment, something no textbook can provide. Most importantly, it kills the fear of judgment, because when you train yourself to accept how you sound and look while speaking English, the opinions of others lose their power, and that freedom is the foundation of true fluency. So use the mirror daily, even for just 1 minute. Speak your sentences with clarity, rhythm, and emotion. Watch yourself transform from hesitant to confident. And remind yourself each time that fluency is not about hiding your voice. It is about owning it fully, with courage, presence, and pride. Shadow speaking and fluency loops. Shadow speaking is like stepping into the shoes of a native speaker and borrowing their rhythm, tone, and flow until it becomes your own. Because in this practice, you don't just repeat words, you mimic the exact music of English in real time, training your mouth, ears, and brain to react together like a single instrument. The method is simple. Take a short clip of natural English, maybe 5 to 10 seconds from a movie, a TED Talk, or even a podcast. Listen once, then immediately repeat out loud, trying to copy not just the words but the pauses, the stress, the melody, even the emotion in the voice. And don't stop to check grammar or meaning, because the goal is rhythm training, not perfection. At first it feels difficult. Your tongue trips, your timing lags. But with every attempt, your muscles adjust, your ears sharpen, and your fluency begins to shift from mechanical to natural. And the beauty of shadowing is that it bypasses overthinking. It forces your brain to keep up with real English speed instead of translating word by word. Pair this with fluency loops, where you take a single sentence and repeat it 3 times, once slowly, once at normal speed, and once as fast as you can without losing clarity. And suddenly your mouth discovers freedom, because you're not locked into one tempo. You're training flexibility, speed control, and confidence under pressure. For example, take the sentence, "I don't have enough time today." First, say it slowly and clearly, "I do not have enough time today." Then say it at a natural pace, "I don't have enough time today." Then push yourself, "I don't have enough time today." Fast, flowing, connected. This layering process trains your mouth to handle English under any condition. Whether you're speaking carefully in an exam or casually with friends, and with daily practice your sentences stop sounding stiff and start sounding alive. Shadow speaking gives you the model. Fluency loops give you the flexibility. And together they create real fluency because you are training like a musician, listening, copying, repeating, adjusting, until the rhythm is in your bones. And here's the key. Don't aim for perfection, aim for flow. Don't stop when you make mistakes, keep going. Because fluency is not about avoiding errors. It's about staying in motion. And the more you shadow and loop, the more your brain learns that English is not a puzzle to solve but a song to perform. So make these practices your daily companions. Spend just 3 minutes with shadowing and loops, and watch as your speech transforms from hesitant and word by word to smooth, confident, and natural. Because once your mouth can ride the rhythm of English at different speeds, nothing can stop you from speaking freely. So here we are, at the end of this journey, and if you've followed every step, you now understand that fluency is not magic, not talent, not perfection. It is daily training of your mouth, your mind, and your courage, built in small, consistent moments that add up to transformation. You've learned that English is a rhythm, a flow, a song of connected clusters. That 5 minutes of focused practice can rewire your brain and muscles, that the mirror builds presence, shadow speaking builds reaction, loops build flexibility, repetition builds strength, and emotion turns sound into expression. You've discovered that fear is the only real enemy, and that your unique English voice is waiting to be claimed, not someday in the future, but today, in this moment, with every word you choose to speak. So as you step away from this training, remember, fluency is not something you hope for. It's something you create each day with courage, discipline, and ownership. Your voice matters, your story matters, and the world is waiting to hear it in your English. Not perfect, but powerful, authentic, and alive. The time to begin is now. The tool is your voice, and the journey is yours to own. Speak boldly, train daily, and never again let silence steal your place. Because this is your English, your identity, and your freedom.